Good morning. If you'll turn with me while we read 1 Samuel, chapter 2, 11 to 26. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home, and the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy, Samuel, continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people.
Thank you, Jim. I'm very grateful for the support of the congregation and also the support of the eldership, and I look forward to sharing some details about the sabbatical as we make some preparations for it this fall. After Hannah's beautiful song in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, the story of 1 Samuel takes a dark turn, and we're brought face to face with the corruption that was commonplace during the time of the judges. The Bible is nothing if it's not honest and accurate in the way it helps to describe how corruption can infect both people and institutions. Phinehas and Hophni, the sons of Eli, now managed the worship site at Shiloh for their aged father Eli. And our text this week leads with the sad and sorrowful fact in verse 12 that Phinehas and Hophni lead Israel in worship, but they do not know the Lord. They do not know the one they are serving. They receive the gifts, but they do not know the ultimate giver. In their work, they've lost their minds and instead have followed their appetites. So a family that comes to Shiloh, bringing a Thanksgiving offering at the tent of meeting at Shiloh, would be subjected to like a shakedown on their way to the altar. Phinehas and Hophni demanding their portion even before it was offered. That's highly irregular. The language here in chapter 2 is brusque, and it's almost satirical or grotesque. Eli's sons had descended into a frenzy of gluttony, poking their 3-pronged forks into every pot and every pan, demanding their cut of what was offered to the Lord, even before it was done being offered. They were, of course, entitled to a portion of the offering. The law makes it clear that was okay. As Levites and servants around the altar, they were given food and money and provision for housing in exchange for the service that they provide to the people of Israel. But this provision had somehow become an entitlement. Corruption had infected the whole institution. And sometimes it even came to violence. Our text tells us that they would threaten worshipers, give us our portion now, or somebody's going to get hurt. As a result, worship no longer bore any resemblance to the one who was being worshiped. In verse 17 in our reading this morning, it says that Phinehas and Hophni scorned the Lord's offering. They despised it. They slandered it. They soiled the worship of the one true God with their own misdirected passions and uncontrolled lusts. So what can you do? What could you do if you lived in Israel at this time, the time of the judges? The law required that you worship at the tent of meeting. The law forbid other altars. There was supposed to be one place of worship for the one true God. All the Israelites were required to make atoning sacrifices, of course. All of them made annual sacrifices, and in addition to that, there were the voluntary offerings, the thanksgiving offerings that were meant to be made out of the overflow of the heart. But the priests were corrupt. The whole system had been compromised. What is God going to do about this? Why does he let this happen? What do you do when it seems like there's nothing that you can do? This despair might feel a little bit familiar this week. The latest offensive in the war in Ukraine has been dragging on for more than 100 days, with no end in sight. With some losses in the south and some gains in the east, it appears to us very far away here in Canada, like a strangled standstill, a stalemate with no end in sight. It feels like there's nothing that we can do about something like that. But war is not the only kind of bloodshed that we have been hearing about over the past few weeks. Mass shootings in the United States have become commonplace since COVID restrictions eased. In fact, mass shootings pass by so quickly, so frequently these days that we lose all sense of scale and scope. Remember that shooting in Buffalo? It was barely 3 weeks ago. It was 3 weeks ago, and it already feels like ancient history. Just 3 weeks ago, 10 people were murdered in a shopping supermarket, barely an hour's drive from here. And it wasn't even the worst shooting that month. The hospital in Tulsa, where Julie's sister works, was attacked this week. Tracy is fine, but it seems absurd to say that only 4 people died. 4 people murdered in their workplace. And it wasn't even the worst shooting this week. It's hard for us to fathom why there can't be something done about military-grade assault weapons. For Canadians, it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to understand why this continues to be a problem. But one thing's for sure, it sure feels like there's nothing we can do about it. Even the shooting in Buffalo, while close, is still miles and miles away. So far away, I have absolutely no control over it. 24-hour news coverage and constant social media access helps create this powerful sense of inevitability and despair. There's religious corruption, stories on the news about the Southern Baptist Convention and the cover-ups of sexual misconducts. It's gotten to the point where my outrage muscles are exhausted. I'm done. I can't even drum up outrage or emotion for everyday nonsense, much less these horrible things. I'm numb to all the bad things that are happening all around the world, things that I can watch 24 hours a day on my phone. I feel helpless, and I can't do anything about it. Now, on a completely different scale, but more local, I worked at a polling site here at the building this week. And I was disappointed by some of the cynicism and hopelessness that was expressed by some of the voters who dropped by. I had somebody tell me with a straight face that Russians were hacking into the little vote scanners that we use. That was the part of the system that I was handling. Hackers had hacked into the vote counters. Something completely absurd and untrue, and something I made sure to correct. They claimed that the outcome's already been decided after all, and AKA my vote doesn't matter, no matter who votes. One person spitballed that with the voter turnout low, the whole process costs about $15 a vote. What a waste, he crowed as he threw up his hands and walked out that door. Now, while that's not true, what's missing in all this bluster is, okay, well then what else would you like to do? I have friends who grew up in Central America who find it right quaint when Canadians complain about political corruption and voter fraud. One woman at Camp Oma a few years ago told me how as a kid she remembered army vehicles arriving in her neighborhood and rounding up voting adults to cast a vote for their illustrious, glorious leader. I'm sure those elections didn't cost very much at all. But what are you going to do? Even if you can't stand any of the candidates on your ballot, one of them is going to represent you this year. One of these fool parties is going to be in power at the end of the day. So what do? In the same way that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's more like apathy. The opposite of hope is not frustration and anger, but it's cynicism and despair. It feels like corruption and incompetence are everywhere, and there's nothing that any one of us can do about it. Surely the gospel gives us a better perspective on this. Surely a better perspective than we get from the rest of the world. Christians are meant to be a hope-filled people, aren't we? We know that we live in a fallen world, but God is still on the throne, is he not? When tragedy prevails week in and week out, it feels like we can't do anything at all. What do? Do we throw up our hands in despair like everyone else? We can pray, but even people are starting to be cynical about that. Thoughts and prayers, they are thought of as helpless and hopeless these days. In the face of escalating gun deaths, should we pray? Well, it's discouraging when people say, keep your thoughts and prayers to yourself, thank you very much. They're useless out here. Social justice warriors might say, in the face of racial violence and continuing escalating animosity, instead of thoughts and prayers, why don't you just do something about it? Sometimes we offer thoughts and prayers as if there's nothing we can do. Only God can do something to address the fallen condition. Or on the other hand, sometimes we take to the streets and protest as if there's nothing God can do. And only we can repair the brokenness in the world. Well, which is it? Do we get out in the world and help to fix it? Or do we sit back and pray and hope God steps in sometime? What do we do as followers of Jesus, the Son of the living God, if we live in a fallen world but believe God is all-knowing and God is all-powerful? We are commanded to bring our worries and cares to God and to leave them at the foot of the cross in faith. And at the same time, we are commissioned to go out into the world so that others can experience the goodness of Jesus even to the ends of the earth. Heaven's striving and human sweat combine to embody and enact the good news in the world, good news that is so desperately needed. In her book, When Thoughts and Prayers Aren't Enough, a shooting survivor's journey into the realities of gun violence, Taylor Schumann writes, I have a complicated relationship with thoughts and prayers. I believe in the power of prayer. I believe in it like I believe the sun will rise and set tomorrow. I believe that through prayer we can seek God and allow him to reveal himself to us. And through that, we may have our eyes opened to his vision of how we can love and serve one another. At the same time, I'm tired of prayer being the end of our work and not the beginning. God has given us access to himself through prayer. God has also given us hands and feet to do the work of bringing a little bit of God's kingdom to his people here on earth. There is so much that we're missing when we let prayer be the period of the sentence of concern for gun violence. There's so much God can do in us and through us when we ask him to break our hearts for what breaks his and to use us in the mending. Thoughts and prayers are not enough, but they were never supposed to be. There is more for us to do. And before we go any further, it might be helpful to clarify what's happening here. So Martin, if you could throw that graph up on the screen. This may be helpful for some of you. It may be completely useless for others. So just indulge me in this for a moment, and then we can use this or not use this. There is two dimensions to our story, if you will, and it would look something like this. There's a vertical axis of God's action in the world, where at the one side you've got God. It has high action, high engagement in the world, and the other side is low. And then on the horizontal basis, you've got another axis for our agency. One side of it is we've got lots of agency. We can change a lot of things. And then on the other side, we've got almost no agency. We can't really change anything at all. In quadrant 1, if you start up in the top left, high action for God, low impact for us. People in that corner think, well, it's all up to God in the end. God has complete control. I have nothing to contribute, so I'll offer my thoughts and prayers, like the proverbial drop in the bucket, and then just wait to see what God is up to. For reasons that we can't understand, those kids died in that school because they were going to die in that school. It's not a very popular position these days in our hyper-individualistic culture. People might think this, but they will very rarely say this out loud. Now, on the bottom left, you've got quadrant 2, which has a very low opinion of God and man. This is where the nihilist and the fatalist, the cynic, lives here. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It's already decided, says someone living in this corner. The world is a handbasket that is on its way to hell, and there is nothing that you can do about it. This position is cynical and hopeless. And yet, I'm amazed at how many followers of Jesus I find in this corner of the grid. People who talk this talk and yet follow Jesus. They say this sometimes in jest, but their words perhaps betray more than they are willing to admit. Now, standing in opposition to that quadrant is quadrant 3, which is over in the bottom right. In this, we are still missing any agency from God, but it believes that humans can make all the difference. It's all up to us, someone would say in this corner. We need to act now to prevent climate emergencies. We need to act now on gun control and on the war in Ukraine. We need to stand up and protest. High value is given to human effort and human agency. And it's a perfectly reasonable place to be, but it assumes the absence of God. A God who started the world up like a wind-up clock and then walked away. Or a God who is active in the past, maybe up to chapter 28 of the book of Acts, but has since withdrawn and left us to our own devices. There is a fourth possibility in the top right, quadrant 4, which holds both divine action and human agency in high regard. There is a strong expectation here that God is righting what is wrong in the world, and there is an equally strong expectation that God's going to use you and I in doing just that. God is going to make right what's wrong in the world, and God is going to make right what's wrong in you and me. It's not an either-or situation. It's a both-and. Hannah knew about the corruption in Shiloh. Of course she did. Her husband worked with these men. Hannah knew about the corruption in Shiloh. Her husband served beside these men, and yet Hannah and Elkanah still chose to worship. It was corrupt, and they worshiped anyway. They arrived every year with their Thanksgiving offering. They brought it every year. Hannah still dared to pour out her heart before the Lord in spite of the religious corruption that existed. She prayed high human agency, and she believed that God heard her thoughts and prayers, and God acted high divine action. She prayed and remained open to what God was accomplishing in her. Hannah prayed, and then she joined God in what God was doing to deliver his people. Hannah continues to participate in what God is accomplishing through her prayer. In spite of the corruption, her little Samuel continues to serve before the Lord, wearing his little linen ephod that she makes every year, replacing it every year because, well, the old one is just a little bit too small anymore. Her faithful continued partnership anticipates God's continued action. The two work together. Samuel was the answer to her prayers for a son, but he might also be the answer to the prayers of the people considering the corruption in worship in Shiloh. Samuel will one day be priest of Shiloh, but Hannah's eyes are on the one whom she worships. She's going to let God deal with the wickedness of Phinehas and Hophni while she works on next year's ephod. What will God do about the wickedness of Phinehas and Hophni? Well, if you read the story, you'll learn that God will give his judgment. They will receive what is due them in due time. But before that, God is working to prepare a man who's going to restore worship in Israel and prepare them for a king. Not the tribal thug kings that you read about in the book of Judges, but a true king, the one that comes after Saul, the one that goes after God's own heart, the one on whom the whole redemption story of Israel pivots. God is at work in the broken tent in Shiloh. He is restoring his people, using people through their own thoughts and prayers. God does not work alone. God has not abandoned us to our own devices. God works in the world, and God uses people. God uses his church. So, Hannah, what are we going to do about all the hypocrites in church? Hannah, what are we going to do? There isn't a political party that lines up with biblical values. Hannah, what can I do when my kids or my grandkids make choices they shouldn't, or go places they shouldn't, or make mistakes, make different mistakes than the ones I made? Hannah says, pray and seek partnership with God. Pray and open your eyes. Pray and look and listen to where God is already at work in your world. Pray and ask God to forgive you of your mistakes in addition to the ones that your kids and your grandkids may make. Pray and then use discerning action to see what God's up to. Prayer and action, they fit together like hand in glove. I have prayed for years here at Tintern for God to help our church with outreach, meaningful outreach into our community. And you know what? My prayers have been changing the past couple of years. I have prayed for wisdom and insight. I've prayed for God to show us what we could do to be a people of peace to the town of Lincoln. And one of the things that's come up recently is a committee that I'm a part of, Committee for Homelessness and Affordable Housing. It just came up on my radar at the end of some time I spent on a committee with the library board. And so I applied. So I was accepted onto this committee. It's got a few members of the town council, a few people from the community. And through that committee, I'm learning what homelessness looks like in Beamsville. There are homeless people in Beamsville. They might not look like they look on the news, or they don't look like they do in St. Catharines or perhaps Toronto. But I've learned to see homeless people in Beamsville, and they look different than you might think. One young man's a 21-year-old high school grad. He's working 3 part-time jobs that pay minimum wage. He lives out of a duffel bag and spends a couple weeks at different friends' houses, sleeping on couches, until he feels like he's worn out his welcome and he moves on to the next place. He can't go home because his home life is something that he had to leave when he was 17 years old. His stepdad and him cannot live under the same roof. So he's been couch surfing ever since. In the summer, he sleeps in outdoor patio furniture in houses maybe in your neighborhood. So if you find your cushions out on the back couch have been moved around or rearranged, it could be a squirrel, could be a raccoon, or it could be him spending a night in your backyard. In the summer, he would shower at the truck stop, sleep in people's backyards, and find a way to connect all these different jobs that he's doing. He has no driver's license. And you might think, well, there's his problem. He needs to go get a driver's license. Well, yeah, but just spin the rims on that for a minute. Who's going to drive him to the test center in Niagara Falls? Or maybe even help him set up a test in the first place? And whose car is he going to drive when he does the test? The simplest things that my kids accomplish are virtually impossible for him. So now my prayers have changed. Now I'm looking for where God is working amongst young people who need help getting started in post-secondary education and developing work schools. I'm asking God to give me eyes to see and ears to hear where He is already at work. And God's work always looks like love, peace, and joy. Love, real love. Peace, a space of peace. And joy, not happiness, joy, is where the Spirit's at work. This is where God's at work. And this is where I would like to partner with Him. Where is God at your work? And how can you join Him in it? What is God up to in your neighborhood? And how can you participate in it? This is what we're called to do. It's not prayer or action. It's not prayer and then act like God's not involved. It's prayer, look, listen. Slow down and look for small things that can be done with great love. Where can you be the answer to somebody else's prayer? What is God already showing you? In our story this morning, Eli's incompetence and the wickedness of Phinehas and Hophni could not stop God from doing what God was going to do. And so today's corruption cannot stop God either. Holy Father, use us in the restoration of all things. Make us wise and tender-hearted, and give us eyes to see and ears to hear the cry of your people. Amen.